IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. So today I'm Bharath Reddy, and I have with me Satya, who's my colleague, and Rahul, who's a GCTP alum from I think a year ago, was it? So we are going to be talking about the deep tech startup policy and looking at why such a policy is required. We'll be talking a little bit about India's R&D investments, especially by the private sector. What are the gaps over there, and why this policy is required, and at a high level, our thoughts on this policy. We might be doing a follow-up series of podcasts where we talk about this policy in a little more detail. So let's get started. This policy defines deep techs as early stage startups which, based on scientific or engineering advancements, they have an advantage, and they are looking to develop this for commercial applications. Now, they also say that the factors that enable deep techs to create and own intellectual property is a distinguishing feature of such deep tech startups. And typically, these startups have very long development life cycles, and they're very capital intensive. So you need consistent funding over a long period of time. And there's a lot of risks involved because you don't know how the results of that research is going to be. It's not a proven technology. So it needs this sustained effort over a long period of time. And there's a lot of risks and also potential opportunities at stake. So in this context, you see, because of the risks involved, because of the longer time frame, you see that there's not a lot of private investment which flows into it, and this policy tries to address that. So that's basically what, at a broad level, this is trying to do. I'll throw it open to both Satya and Rahul to talk about why they think, from their perspectives, such a policy would be required. Maybe Rahul, you could come in from an engineering background where you're working in a technology company, and Satya, maybe from a legal perspective, you can talk about how what is the necessity of such a policy before we get into the other aspects. So Rahul, over to you.
Yeah. Hey, folks. So the last time when I was doing the course, one of the assignments that I had was to talk to people in the community around me and try and understand the kind of public policy issues that they were facing. As part of that exercise, I reached out to my sister-in-law and her husband, who run a hardware services firm. For about 7 years now, they've been based out of Delhi, and they've been trying to provide hardware services which involve things like designing PCBs, doing 3D modeling, and actually creating 3D structures, creating entire electronics modules and assembling them, and doing short production runs for custom projects. There's maybe a few startups which have mostly a software component but need a bit of hardware. In some cases, there are hardware startups which are trying to figure out some part of their hardware, and they need external expertise, and that is where these people come in. During my conversation with the both of them, the main thing that I realized was they rely on China a lot. They rely on China a lot to be able to manufacture PCBs in small runs, to be able to create these molded containers which actually hold the hardware, to be able to procure basic things that they need to build the hardware components, etc., etc. So they were talking about how one of the fundamental policy issues that they face is the fact that there is no sort of enabling ecosystem that is like within an hour. So they can't just go somewhere and then meet people and then immediately know, yep, this person will print PCBs for me. That is where I'll buy all of my components in bulk. This is where I can go to do 3D injection molding. And then, like, voila, within a week, I can create a prototype, send it out for prototyping, get back the actual thing, and then do immediate iterations. So in that sense, I do feel like we need a deep tech policy, because we need to be able to create an enabling ecosystem to be able to support the deep techs, to be able to iterate faster on the problems that they're running into. Like you mentioned, Bharath, these are already problems which have very long lead times. So whatever we can do to reduce that lead time, like, we should be doing. And there are parts of the draft policy which, like, absolutely address that issue.
Right. Thanks,
So
Rahul.
to add on that, again, coming from the legal perspective, the reason why we need an enabling ecosystem in the first place is because you need to intervene in multiple different stages of a deep tech startup. Let's say you would look at research, development, and innovation. You have to look at protecting the intellectual property rights or facilitating the proliferation of access to those, funding and investment, enabling infrastructure and resource sharing, as well as regulations, standards, certifications, things like regulatory sandboxes come into picture, which is why the having things be explicitly stated in legalese, so to speak, is very essential for any sort of progress in this field.
Right. I think building off on what Rahul was saying about being dependent on China or something like that. So Takshila, we have worked on something called a techno strategic doctrine for India. So as part of that, what we try to look at is we lay out a strategy for a broad principle based approach for looking at why the way technology should be adopted. How do you approach investment? How do you approach building capabilities in technology, and why should you do it? So it lays down these kind of broad principles. So what we some of those kind of are applicable here as well. So firstly, it's like technology is an important element of national power, and building your technological strengths helps to bring about, not just makes you good in that technology, but also brings about peace and prosperity for all citizens and so on, right? It also has a lot of positive externalities in the sense that you get good at something, say like what happened with ISRO. Now you're able to launch a satellite into space, and that has a lot of other kind of spillover effects in a lot of the other different areas. Of late, over the past few years, we see that there's a lot of competition, there's a lot of cooperation with select bilateral, multilateral partnerships, and there's a lot of conflict especially in deep tech areas. So, technology has become increasingly interlinked with the geopolitics of the day, and you see that there's a lot of partnership, there's a lot of sanctions to prevent rivals from gaining an edge, and you see that it's important for countries to be able to either build that technology ecosystem or to be able to have access to it in some form. So I think that's an important part, and this kind of tries to address these kind of requirements. So moving on, I think we can look at the R&D expenditure story in India. So India's gross expenditure on R&D has been growing over the past 10 years. It's growing at a consistent rate, but it's just keeping pace with the GDP growth. So you see that India spends around 0.64 percentage of its GDP on R&D. This is in the year 2020-21. This is somewhat lesser than a lot of our peers and far lesser than most developed countries, which spend around 2% of their GDP. For even China, for example, spends 2.4 percentage of their GDP on R&D. Now, another worrying thing about India is that just 40% of this already low expenditure on GDP comes from private sector companies. And the union governments, state governments, public sector industry, and state funded educational institutions make up the rest of the 60%. So you see that the private sector is not pulling its weight. It's not investing as much as other countries see in from the private sector. So other developed countries, for example, see that the private sector invests almost 70% of the total expenditure on R&D investments, and the government sector contribution is far lesser. So you see that there's this kind of R&D investments are crucial, and that there is a lack of investment from the private sector, and this is kind of the reason why this kind of a policy is necessary to remove those barriers, make it easier for companies to get in. Any thoughts about these aspects?
If I'll go first, this is very much keeping in line with some of the considerations mentioned in the deep tech policy, the draft policy, where they do mention multiple times about strategic sectors and startups within those sectors needing a lot more help, or an ecosystem, enabling ecosystem. The same thing also features in the National Research Foundation. Well, now it's the Act, the erstwhile bill, where they talk about private sector expenditure being essential for funneling to funding R&D and innovation in today's economy. The problem is, as we've figured out, that i- despite moving from GERD to per capita expenditure on R&D, India is still very low, and the NRF's details, while still being very opaque, they envisage private funding to come via the route of, let's say, CSR, and that's not exactly a very well made incentive structure to incentivize R&D funding. The primary issue again, is basically that there exists no proper industry academia nexus in India, where discoverability of intellectual property or research, etc., does not happen properly, right? So, and that is not something you can solve without proper incentive structures, and neither the deep tech startup policy or the NRF addresses this properly. I'll wait for Rahul to give his perspective on this before, maybe when we towards the end of the podcast we'll talk about potential recommendations.
Um, yeah, so this specifically was for me what the main priority for the draft policy should have been. That the draft policy would somehow help increase the private sector R&D expenditure, maybe by ensuring that whatever R&D the private sector is spending on is generating things which the government could buy back. So, for example, one of the things that, like, for me, is the main priority is promoting the public and private adoption of indigenous deep tech through favorable procurement rules. This for me was a big deal because personally, at least in my understanding, one of the reasons why the West, specifically the US, is the scientific and technological superpower that it is because there was a lot of demand driven initiatives where there was a lot of need for scientific and technological breakthrough before, during, and after the war. And that pushed private public and private procurement, and that pushed a lot of enterprises to invest in R&D. That was also coincidentally the time when the tax laws ensured that the companies spent on R&D instead of on instead of doing other things with whatever profits that they were generating. This is definitely something that needs to be hit hard in the policy, and that needs to become the main focus. And there's a few things in the policy that address some of the things that, like, you highlighted, Satya, but I agree that they don't address them fully. Like, basically trying to ensure that trying to improve discoverability of the work that is happening in academia, and trying to bridge the gap between academia and industry to try and ensure that people know what is going on both sides, and people can come together easily and create something new together. There's parts of the policy which do enable it, and there's scope for improvement.
There is also mention of things like the startups who are beneficiaries of the policy being made to share the research data findings, etc., which doesn't make any sense, right? Like if you're trying to encourage private sector investment into this, why would you want the beneficiaries of the investment to give away the intellectual property? Or I mean, I'm not sure. Maybe they meant something else differently, but it's not specified what it is exactly. So, aside from maybe poor drafting of the policy, this is something which is especially egregious.
Right. We'll come into some of the some of our thoughts on the policy. Maybe we'll take a quick break and we'll come back to discuss further about what we think the policy gets right and what we think could be improved.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
So welcome back. So we were discussing about the deep tech policy, and now we'll get into some of our takeaways from the policy. So I'll throw it open to Rahul and Satya to get their views on what the policy gets right, firstly, so that we can look at what is good about it, what it is trying to do that is expected to yield the desired outcomes. So before we get into that, maybe we'll just touch upon what the broad objectives that the policy lays out in the beginning that it would like to achieve. So broadly, the policy lays out 4 different objectives. So one is economic growth. The second is a transition to a knowledge-driven economy. The third is bolstering national capability and sovereignty through the Atmanirbhar Bharat imperative. And lastly, encouraging ethical innovation. So these are the broad 4 objectives that the policy lays out. There are other things like retaining talent, getting more diversity into the R&D ecosystem. You have a lot of subcategories of all of these things which they have things. So getting more bridging the divide in between the academia and research and industry, and strengthening the IP ecosystem and all of these things. So before but broadly, those are the 4 objectives. So now, what does the policy get right in achieving these objectives, and what are your thoughts on this?
I think starting off, just having the existence of a formal policy is a huge stride, because the moment this happens, right, it's going to evoke interest from all sorts of private and even foreign interest. I'm not sure if this is a great way to like enable marginal development by having something which is obviously half baked as this policy, and having marginal improvements to it made over time. But the fact that its emphasis is on nurturing research and development through financial incentives and auditing mechanisms to foster innovation is probably the linchpin here. I mean, they've identified the problem properly of India's present challenges. That I think is probably the best thing to come out of this entire thing. And a lot of the principles that they espouse, the first principles, let's say, things about strengthening the IP regime through measures like streamlined processes or unified IP framework. That's a good approach. That's a good first principle, I would say. And having that be explicitly mentioned is a great idea. That's from the top of my mind. I'll think about it a little bit further if you can say anything about it.
Yeah. Rahul, what does the policy get right according to you?
I'll actually pick something that you briefly mentioned, Bharath, which is trying to ensure ethical innovation, but also trying to bring a broader set of people into the deep tech ecosystem in general. Like one of the hot takes that I remember reading, like within the first week of the draft policy being published, was somebody mentioning, "Hey, look, there's already a lot of issues, and like we shouldn't really be worrying about trying to diversifying the pool of people in this community, or trying to diversify the places where these companies are popping up from, etc., etc." And like the more I think about it, the more I feel like this is one of those fundamental issues where like addressing it after the fact is going to be much harder. So I found it personally very interesting that they decided, no, hey, we need to again like work on this from the very beginning. Try and ensure that we are not again growing a deep tech ecosystem which is only available in Bangalore or the metro cities, and instead we're actually trying to bring up the entire country and a lot of these smaller pockets everywhere in the country where we are trying to have innovation happen. That I found personally very interesting. Apart from that, again, like echoing some of the things that Satya mentioned, it's good that this is being explicitly put out there. It's good to know that the government feels like this is something that is necessary and this is something that they want to address. Large parts of the policy are again just absolutely great right off the bat. Again, trying to ensure that a lot of the policy talks about how they're trying to incentivize companies to do more R&D and support more deep tech work. But we do also have parts of the policy which is talking about how we can ensure that people are procuring the deep tech innovation that is happening. People are procuring services from deep tech companies, or people are procuring products from deep tech companies. So in that sense, it does address both the supply and the demand sides of the equation. So it definitely does have a large part of the solution more or less in place. But yeah, we do feel like there's a few pieces here and there that could be improved.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you're saying about the procurement guarantees and creating that demand, right? So that's a really important part, especially for these deep tech startups which have a longer gestation period. You have a lot of uncertainty, and these kind of guarantees can, go a long way in seeing them through those difficult times. I one of the other some of the other things that I found interesting were that it has initiatives to help these startups get global reach, from having representation in foreign delegations, to making efforts to source strategic materials, to having representation during the free trade agreement consultations. All of these are really important to help these local startups reach scale and to address international markets. Another interesting area where this policy looks at is the incentives of academics in higher education institutions, aligning them towards commercialization of some of the research, making the schemes or the grants which are available for research and development more easily accessible to these researchers. All of these, I think, will go a long way in aligning some of the academic research towards commercialization, towards making it accessible to for people in the industry to be able to come and invest in those people and build partnership with them. All of these things will be a good kind of a collaboration which might come out as a result of these initiatives. But Rahul, on one of the things that you mentioned, right? So you said that you like that it especially makes an effort to address the tier 2 and tier 3 cities, or reaching out to. I don't know if how maybe you can just correct me about what I'm saying. So what I was thinking is that the cities are where innovation would happen most likely, especially on areas which involve a deeper technology. That's where you're likely to find the talent across disciplines coming together to create something which might be lacking in a tier 2 or tier 3 city, or I don't know if that should be the focus of this policy at all. So the policy talks about getting deep tech to reach, say, tier 2 tier 3 cities, getting participation from marginalized communities, underrepresented communities. So this, I think, is something which I'm not able to see how it would actually play out in practice. So what do you think about this?
Uh, so some of this is codified in the draft policy and some of this is not. But personally, I feel like this is a step in the right direction. One of the things that I imagine is if we can have more. So yeah, just taking a step back, when we're looking at the existing deep tech ecosystem, one, there are people from metro cities who are mostly involved in deep tech, and two, a lot of the people who are involved in deep tech are, again, a majority of them are people who come from some of the tier 1 institutions, not just tier 1 cities, but tier 1 institutions, academic institutions in the cities, like the IITs and the NITs. So in that sense, like there's a lot more. If we want to support the deep tech ecosystem and grow it, then we need a lot more people who can work at these companies. And if we need more people who can work at these companies, then we need to be able to foster a much more broader set of people with the right set of skills. So that is one sense in which the government should be pushing for a broader net, where we are not only trying to hire from the metro areas, but rather, like, we should be trying to hire people from across the country, after giving them the resources to be able to train them up in a meaningful way. Like, for example, some parts of the draft policy talk about how ensuring diversity is also going to ensure that certain set of problems are going to be surfaced. Like, for example, somebody from Himachal is going to know what the actual problems in Himachal are. Like, for example, something related to the climate change issues that are happening, how climate change impacts agriculture, and so on. So some aspects of that are of the draft policy are around how we'll have a much broader definition or much broader kinds of deep tech companies that could come up if we ensure that we are trying to attract attention from a diverse set of people. But I do agree with you in that, like, currently this is what the situation is, but I do feel like the government has the imperative to try and broaden the pool from simply being the metro cities where the people already exist. This is sort of a wish list of mine, which is why I wanted to highlight it.
Right. Right. So we'll move on now to some of the areas which we think there are some gaps, or there could be some, something that we think could have been done differently. I'll throw it back to you again, Rahul. So, what are some of the areas which you would have liked to see in a different, way, implemented differently?
Uh, I'll start with what I call messes in the draft policy. So one of them is around creating talent, and the other is what I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation. So in terms of creating talent, the draft policy already talks about how college courses can be modified to focus on project work instead of coursework, and how graduate students can be incentivized to pursue internships at deep tech startups and so on. That is definitely a recipe to try and ensure that there's a larger pool of talent that startups can tap into. For me, I feel like, again, this is quite probably out of scope for the draft policy. I feel like we need to be paying the graduate researchers more money. Identifying a few people and then telling them that, hey, look, you can do a project instead of a course, or telling a few people that, hey, look, you can go and do an internship instead of something else, feels like a piecemeal solution. Whereas a more systemic solution would be something like, again, you are paying the graduate students who are spending 5 years or more pursuing their graduate studies, and are the people who are creating a large number of the deep tech startups, because again they have spent half a decade deeply involved in the scientific or technological domain. It feels like supporting them financially through that time by paying them better would be a better way to ensuring that we have a larger talent pool. There's a lot of people like who pursue graduate studies who simply fall back to moving on from their domain and simply taking up a software job because they've been so financially depleted over those 5 years that they have no better option. Again, like this is one of those wish list items for me. It feels a bit out of scope for the draft policy, but I did want to bring it up. The other thing is what I mentioned at the beginning, which is the hardware ecosystem. Like we can't have deep tech startups, especially we can't have this like proliferation of deep tech startups without the right hardware ecosystem that they need. Again, simple things like being able to procure all of the electronic items that you need, all of the electrical items that you need, being able to find a supplier for 3D injection and things of that sort. Like everything that is involved in being able to go from a thought on paper to a design on a computer to an actual physical thing in front of you, and then being able to do that frequently, it necessitates the existence of a hardware ecosystem, an accessible hardware ecosystem that is close to you. And yeah, going back to again like what you said right at the beginning, like without that, without the existence of that, we will always be slower than some of the other companies. Like everybody has the same ideas, it's about execution that matters, and if we execute slower than the other person, then we'll end up being left behind. So these two feel like fundamental misses in the draft policies, which again are very broad in scope, but I feel like they are also going to have a large impact on the fundamental objectives that the policy has.
Right. So Satya, now we'll move on to your what you think of what are the misses from this policy. In your mind, what do you think that the policy could improve upon, and what are the areas that you would like to see brought in?
So going back to the four pillars as I mentioned earlier, there's secure economic future, progress towards a knowledge-driven economy, and bolstering national capability and sovereignty via the Atmanirbhar Bharat narrative, right? And then there's ethical innovation, but that's beyond my purview. But basically, yes, they hit the nail when they talked about R&D and innovation ecosystem being the linchpin there, right? This makes me curious to see how the policy was drafted, especially when it does not harmonize with the mechanisms, processes, and incentive structures that the National Research Foundation proposes or might propose, right? Especially with the private sector CSR funding thing. I'll come to it later. There's also issues with definitional guidelines. How did they arrive at the factors determining what deep tech is or what it isn't? Did they refer to any global consensus on the definitions? Have they haven't provided examples of deep tech incubation and launches in other jurisdictions either, right? There's also, I mean, they could have given examples of measurement systems to figure out technology. So, for example, there is NASA has a system to test the maturity level of technology to map the growth path of deep tech, for instance. It's called technology readiness levels. It was I think it was published in 2012 or something. And there's a 9-step process where they're given any sort of technology is rated according to it, according to the project's progress, and then it gives a more concrete path for governmental intervention or even private sector intervention to happen. Right. So this should have been the first few things that would have come across from the policy. Finally, the Atmanirbharta part is somehow misguided in my opinion, because why is it necessary to promote deep tech? On the other hand, we should be allowing cost competitive inputs to be available easily and accessible to deep tech startups, especially because it's so much more expensive for deep tech startups to maintain and progress from one stage of development to the other, right? So not sure where Atmanirbharta needs to be the primary focus here, because if there are domestic alternatives to like technology or equipment that that can allow deep tech startups to flourish, then that's a good way for competition to happen, right? That's a good way to like stymie brain drain, even that's on a tangential note. And funding for research is something I think Rahul should take up because he has a lot more experience with this. So over to you, Rahul.
Yeah, thanks, Satya. Um, so one of the things that the draft policy talks about is trying to reroute CSR funding to be able to do more R&D, to be able to to be able to reroute CSR funding to R&D work, specifically for deep technologies. This I feel is a bit unnecessary, or at least it feels like the wrong solution to the right problem. It is absolutely necessary that we need more private investment in R&D. We need the private enterprises to be able to spending more money, both internally and through partnerships with public institutions, public academic institutions. But trying to reroute CSR funding feels like the wrong way of going about it, mainly because we have enough things that desperately need CSR funding in the first place, and redirecting that to R&D feels like you're shortchanging multiple people. And this also feels like feels like a bad way of setting up things for the future, where again, companies will understandably prefer investing in R&D, which could actually come back to them as future revenue, which sort of feels like going against what CSR is supposed to do in the first place. Apart from that, we absolutely do need. While I've said that, I do feel like we do need more private investment in academic research.
Right. So thanks, thanks, Satya. So those are really valid points, and CSR especially has many objectives, and there's no the incentives to game it are very high, right? So it's better to have a clear purpose which would not otherwise be met by this thing. So research, for example, is in the interest of the companies to invest in. So you need not take the CSR part to incentivize that. So that's really a very valid point. So lastly, I think we can come down to one of the areas. I think that Rahul, you have submitted comments on this policy already, and that is the impact of this policy on free and open source software. So you specifically worked on some of the implications of the IP, intellectual property suggestions of this policy and its impact on FOSS. So would you like to share your views on that?
So one of the priorities that the policy talks about is it talks about the draft policy highlights that the current national IPR policy does not extensively address. I'm quoting things verbatim here, more or less. Does not extensively address the eligibility of computer programs per se, or algorithms for patent protection. And the draft policy talks about how most of the deep tech startups in India rely on advanced digital frontier technologies and being heavily dependent on algorithms and APIs as their primary source of novelty. We agree that there's a lot of deep tech startups which do rely on algorithms and API, and that's what their differentiating factor is. But we fundamentally disagree with making any changes which will lead to more software patents. Who do I mean by we here? So I am a volunteer with this nonprofit called FOSS United. One of our policy initiatives is to prevent software patents and to end software patents in India. We're following similar efforts that are happening around the world, and this is mainly because the same way mathematics is not patentable, algorithms which are applied mathematics should not be patentable. So ideologically, we disagree with like this specific change that is proposed in the draft policy. If you would like to know more about this and want to understand what specifically we mean here and the kind of impact these changes can have on the ecosystem, please check out endsoftwarepatents.in. We've tried talking to industry partners and academic partners to understand their viewpoints on this, and like we've been able to get a reasonable broad group to support us behind this effort. So yeah, this is one of the fundamental things that we at Fosinated disagree with, that there needs to be changes to the IPR policy to allow more software patents. We have talked to legal firms that have helped us understand how much things could cost if a software patent is granted, which a deep tech startup could be infringing on. And like we talked about, deep tech startups are by nature extremely risky investments, and they have very long lead times. If it so happens that the deep tech startup is infringing on a software patent and the patent holder decides to sue the deep tech startup, that will prohibitively inhibit the startup from generating revenue and could basically doom the startup's future. So this is something that we very strongly disagree with in the draft policy.
Right. Thanks, Rahul. So, Satya, anything else you would like to add on this point?
I'll just echo what Rahul's point is. Rahul's point was that yes, there's no reason for this policy to be entangling so many different objectives under the guise of a single policy. And this relates back to what we learned about the National Research Foundation earlier last week as well, is that the idea behind getting CSR funding to be the linchpin behind private sector investment into R&D and the innovation ecosystem in India is fundamentally skewed. The incentives needed for that to succeed don't exactly flow well with the objectives of this policy. We don't know what exactly drove the drafters of the policy to incorporate this or to focus on this specifically, but yeah, this is policy making 101 that the GCPP of Takshashila policy school teaches everyone very well. So yeah.
Right. Thanks, Satya, and thanks, Rahul, for sharing your feedback on this. So the policy is still accepting comments till September 15th. So if you work in a deep tech startup or in this deep tech space and you would like to share your comments, head over to the website and share your comments. So thank you all for listening in, and thank you, Rahul and Satya, for joining. And we'll be following this up with maybe a few more webinars where we look at some specific aspects of the policy, and as we try to unravel this and understand it better. So yeah, thanks again, and see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.